Toronto wanted to get rid of poverty, and to do that, the city tried something bold, something it was certain would work. But decades later, the experiment is still remembered for all the wrong reasons. This is the story of Regent Park. To understand Regent Park, we have to go back to Toronto in the 1930s, and to a neighborhood called Cabbage Town. Once home to working families, by the 20th century, part of it had become one of the city's poorest districts. Many houses lacked basic amenities, and conditions would be considered substandard by any measure. A committee headed by Lieutenant Governor Herbert Bruce, convened in 1934, examined the physical conditions in two of the city's slums, the Ward and Moss Park. The resulting statistics from the 1,332 dwellings they reviewed were grim. 55% were infested with vermin, 57% were overcrowded, 58% were damp, 59% lacked a bathtub, 75% fell below minimum health standard, and 96% generally fell below existing standards for home amenities. Despite many recommendations and reports over the next decade that promoted slum clearance, nothing was built, as no level of government wanted to assume the financial cost. Then came the Second World War, and the city changed again. When the war ended, hundreds of servicemen returned home, eager for stable jobs and families of their own. The city's population grew, and with growth came a new set of worries. Where would people live? Pressure came from labor unions and veterans groups to start building. Prime Minister Mackenzie King's Liberal government tried to address this issue through its Housing Act of 1944, under which federal funds were provided to assist construction of housing. Its powers included the right to issue loans to a limited dividend housing company to support construction of low rental housing, and under another provision of the Act, grants were to be made available to municipalities for clearance of slums for this purpose. The terms and levels of support were, however, less than generous. The government was not eager to get into the housing business, believing that this should be left to local and private initiative. So in the absence of federal and provincial support, Toronto's municipal leaders decided to go ahead on their own. A coalition of civic organizations persuaded the mayor and council to put the following question to voters in the municipal election of January 1st, 1947. Are you in favor of the city undertaking as a low-cost or moderate-cost rental housing project with possible government assistance, the clearance, replanning, rehabilitation and modernization of the area bounded by Parliament, River, Gerrard and Dundas streets, known as the Regent Park North Plan, at an estimated cost of $5,900,000? The votes came during a period when Torontonians were feeling less cheap than usual. They had just approved a subway system the previous year. Regent Park was approved by a vote of 29,677 to 18,028. Those who planned and promoted Regent Park did take a generally patronizing tone toward the residents. The negative features of the former neighborhood were often exaggerated, while the benighted inhabitants were portrayed as desperate to improve their lives through better housing. This attitude was exemplified by a 1953 dramatization, Farewell Oak Street, produced by the Canadian National Film Board. Another noteworthy feature of the film, and of much of the public discussion of Regent Park during its development and first years of operation, was environmental determinism. The negative qualities of the old Cabbage Town neighborhood were, in this view, the result of overcrowded and squalid living conditions. Once these were eliminated, the residents would also be transformed into exemplary citizens. With approval secured, the city created the Housing Authority of Toronto to oversee construction. Groundbreaking took place in September 1948, marking the start of a neighborhood designed to test whether modern design could reshape lives, a bold experiment whose results would resonate for decades. Demolition began in the eastern section of Regent Park. Rows of aging houses were cleared and construction unfolded in phases over the next decade. The early phase, or North Regent Park, finished construction in 1957. The new buildings were 3 to 6 story high, accompanied by rows of townhouses. These buildings were arranged in megablocks, with internal courtyards and very limited street frontage, reflecting modernist planning principles of the era rather than a traditional street grid. The later phase, or South Regent Park, was completed 2 years later in 1959, and it included a mix of townhouses and 5 apartment towers. The towers were spaced apart with open lawns and walkways between them, again not following a traditional street grid. The final product covered about 69 acres and was bounded by Gerrard, Parliament, Shooter, and River Streets. About 2,800 units were built, becoming home to roughly 7,500 residents. Rents were set at generally 20% of family income, with initial priority given to low and moderate income families living in the neighborhood as of July 1947. In March 1949, the first family, the Blewetts, moved into the complex. The family described their unit like walking into a dream and planned to start a new life at Regent Park. By the late 1950s, Regent Park was still being described as a success. City planners, housing officials, and politicians pointed to the new buildings, improved sanitation, and the scale of the intervention as proof that Toronto had finally solved a long-standing urban problem. But within a decade, the confidence behind that vision began to fade. To understand this, we must look at 3 main pillars. Firstly, at Regent Park's planning. By the late 1960s, critics inside the planning profession were openly acknowledging that something had gone wrong. The original belief had been simple: remove slum housing, replace it with modern buildings, and social problems would fade. Instead, Regent Park had become a neighborhood made almost entirely of people facing hardship: the poor, the disabled, families with limited resources, all concentrated in one place. Planners later admitted that this kind of concentration made it extremely difficult for strong, stable community leadership to emerge over time. The neighborhood had housing, but it lacked the social and economic diversity that allows community to regenerate themselves. Secondly, we must look at the economy and political ideology. By the end of the 1960s, Canada's political and economic priorities changed. After the oil shock and economic slowdown of the early 1970s, governments increasingly embraced ideas that emphasize individual responsibility over collective solutions, market delivery over public provision, and spending cuts over social investment. Public housing, especially large, state-built projects like Regent Park, no longer fit the prevailing ideology. What had once been seen as a moral obligation of the state was increasingly framed as an expensive liability. And as funding priorities shifted, Regent Park began to suffer from long-term neglect. Maintenance budgets were cut. Major renovations were postponed. Responsibility for housing moved between levels of government. Over the following decades, no single level of government wanted full responsibility for the neighborhood. When the federal government withdrew from social housing in the early 1990s, provinces were left to manage the system, and soon after, municipalities inherited responsibilities without the financial tools to properly fund it. The same period also marked the deterioration of the economic position of the working poor. Manufacturing jobs disappeared. Minimum wage lost significant purchasing power. Real wages declined. Many residents worked, but still struggled to afford basic necessities. The safety net that had existed when Regent Park was first conceived had thinned. Finally, we must look at society and the media at the time. Once predominantly white and working class, Regent Park became one of the most ethnically diverse neighborhoods in Toronto. Residents came from dozens of countries and spoke hundreds of languages. Most residents were immigrants or children of immigrants. Statistically, Regent Park did not resemble the racially segregated ghettos of some American cities. Yet, public perception often ignored this reality. Regent Park began to be described in the media using the same language once applied to the slums it replaced. It was increasingly framed as dangerous, rightfully so multiple times, dysfunctional, and poorly planned, a place associated with welfare dependency and crime. And this reputation mattered. Once Regent Park was widely seen as a failed experiment in public housing, it became politically vulnerable. Governments became hesitant to invest further in a project already labeled a mistake. By the late 1990s, Regent Park was widely viewed as an unsolvable problem, too expensive to fix, too stigmatized to defend, too politically risky to champion. By the early 2000s, it was clear that Regent Park's original build form could not simply be patched up. In response, Toronto Community Housing and the City of Toronto moved forward with one of the largest urban redevelopment projects the city had ever seen, the Regent Park revitalization. This plan was formally endorsed by City Council in 2003 and launched in earnest a few years later as a comprehensive strategy to redesign the neighborhood's physical layout and social fabric. The revitalization was structured as a 5-phase, multi-decade project covering the 69-acre site east of downtown Toronto between Gerrard, Parliament, Shooter, and River Streets. Rather than simply renovating old buildings, the plan called for the systematic demolition of nearly all original Regent Park structures and their replacement with a new mix of housing types, including rent-geared-to-income or RGI units, affordable rentals, and market condominiums, along with commercial spaces, parks, and community facilities. Demolition activities began in the mid-2000s and continued through multiple phases of redevelopment. Early demolition made way for new rental buildings, mid-rise townhouses, and condominium towers designed to open up the site, reintroduce city streets, and connect Regent Park back into the surrounding neighborhood. More recently, in 2023 and 2024, demolition resumed on the final blocks of the original housing stock in Regent Park, marking an end-of-an-era moment for the old neighborhood. Once complete, Regent Park is expected to house far more residents than under the old model, with estimates of thousands more units. The mix of public, affordable, and market housing is designed to change the neighborhood's economic mix while providing a broader range of amenities and connections to jobs and services. The redevelopment included new community facilities, such as the Pam McConnell Aquatic Center, Denio Spectrum Arts and Cultural Center, and athletic grounds and park upgrades. Unlike the original Regent Park, which was built largely as a housing solution, the revitalized version was conceived as a full neighborhood with commercial and civic infrastructure integrated from the start. Although the revitalization has succeeded in transforming the neighborhood physically and introducing new services, it has also faced challenges, including financial shortfalls, delays, and debates about whether it can protect affordability and community cohesion in the long term. It is early to say how this neighborhood will develop and mature over the next decades, but it clearly seems like the main pitfalls that doomed the old Regent Park would acknowledge and corrected during design. So, did Toronto eliminate poverty? No city has done that. But Regent Park shows something important. Urban design shapes opportunity, but it does not replace economic policy. The original Regent Park attempted to remove poverty by replacing buildings. The revitalized Regent Park attempts to integrate diverse financial backgrounds with a broader urban system. Both approaches reflect belief in planning as a tool for social change. Whether that belief succeeds depends on forces far beyond architecture alone. Today, if you stand at Dundas in Parliament, you will not see the brick superblock of 1949. You will see high-rises, glass balconies, retail storefronts, and a completely new environment. Regent Park is no longer hidden from Toronto, but its story remains a reminder. Cities are experiments, and every solution becomes the next generation's lesson. If you like this type of content and would like to learn more about the environment that surrounds us, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to this channel. Stay tuned for more!